Abraham Lincoln and the Abolition of Slavery in the United States by Charles Godfrey Leland. Chapter 1. Abraham Lincoln was born in Kentucky on the 12th day of February, 1809. The log cabin, which was his birthplace, was built on the south branch of Nolan's Creek, 3 miles from the village of Hodgensville, on land which was then in the county of Hardin, but is now located in that of LaRue. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was born in 1778. His mother's maiden name was Nancy Hanks. The Lincoln family, which appears to have been of unmixed English descent, came to Kentucky from Berks County, Pennsylvania, to which place tradition or conjecture asserts they had emigrated from Massachusetts. But they did not remain long in Pennsylvania, since they seem to have gone before 1752 to Rockingham County, Virginia, which state was then one with that of Kentucky. There is, however, so much doubt as to these details of their early history that it is not certain whether they were at first emigrants directly from England to Virginia, an offshoot of the historic Lincoln family in Massachusetts, or of the highly respectable Lincolns of Pennsylvania. This obscurity is plainly due to the great poverty and lowly station of the Virginian Lincolns. "My parents," said President Lincoln in a brief autobiographic sketch, "were both born of undistinguished families, second families, perhaps, I should say." To this he adds that his paternal grandfather was Abraham Lincoln, who migrated from Rockingham County, Virginia, to Kentucky, about 1781 or 2, although his cousins and other relatives all declare this grandsire's name to have been Mordecai, a striking proof of the ignorance and indifference of the family respecting matters seldom neglected. This grandfather, Abraham or Mordecai, having removed to Kentucky, the dark and bloody ground, settled in Mercer County. Their house was a rough log cabin, their farm a little clearing in the midst of the forest. One morning, not long after their settlement, the father took Thomas, his youngest son, and went to build a fence a short distance from the house, while the other brothers, Mordecai and Josiah, were sent to a field not far away. They were all intent upon their work, when a shot from a party of Indians in ambush was heard. The father fell dead. Josiah ran to a stockade, or settlement, 2 or 3 miles off. Mordecai, the eldest boy, made his way to the house, and, looking out from a loophole, saw an Indian in the act of raising his little brother from the ground. He took deliberate aim at a silver ornament on the breast of the Indian, and brought him down. Thomas sprang towards the cabin, and was admitted by his mother, while Mordecai renewed his fire at several other Indians who rose from the covert of the fence or thicket. It was not long before Josiah returned from the stockade with a party of settlers, but the Indians had fled, and none were found but the dead one and another one who was wounded, and had crept into the top of a fallen tree. Mordecai, it is said, hated the Indians ever after with an intensity which was unusual even in those times. As Ellen Macaulay, in Waverley, is said to have hunted down the children of the mist, or as the Quaker Nathan, in Bird's romance of Nick of the Woods, is described as hunting the Shawnees, so are we told this other avenger of blood pursued his foes with unrelenting, unscrupulous hatred. For days together he would follow peaceable Indians as they passed through the settlements in order to get secret shots at them. Mordecai, the Indian killer, and his brother Josiah remained in Virginia, and grew up to be respectable, prosperous men. The younger brother, Thomas, was always idle, thriftless, poor, a hunter, and a rover. He exercised occasionally, in a rough way, the calling of a carpenter, and, wandering from place to place, began at different times to cultivate the wilderness, but with little success, owing to his laziness. Yet he was a man of great strength and vigor, and once thrashed the monstrous bully of Breckinridge County in 3 minutes, and came off without a scratch. He was an inveterate talker, or popular teller of stories and anecdotes, and a Jackson Democrat in politics, which signified that he belonged to the more radical of the 2 political parties which then prevailed in America. In religion he was, says Lamon, who derived his information from Mr. W. H. Herndon, nothing at times, and a member of various denominations by turns. In 1806 he lived at Elizabethtown in Hardin County, Kentucky, where, in the same year and place, he married Nancy Hanks. The exact date of the marriage is unknown. It is said of this young woman that she was a tall and beautiful brunette, with an understanding which, by her family at least, was considered wonderful. She could read and write, as rare accomplishments in those days in Kentucky backwoods as they still are among the poor whites of the South or their Western descendants. In later life she was sadly worn by hard labor, both in the house and fields, and her features were marked with a melancholy which was probably constitutional, and which her son inherited. It is to be regretted that President Abraham Lincoln never spoke, except with great reluctance, of his early life, or of his parents. As it is, the researches of W. H. Herndon and others have indicated the hereditary sources of his chief characteristics. We know that the grandfather was a vigorous backwoodsman who died a violent death, that his uncle was a grim and determined manslayer, carrying out for years the blood feud provoked by the murder of his parent, that his mother was habitually depressed, and that his father was a favorite of both men and women, though a mere savage when irritated, fond of fun, an endless storyteller, physically powerful, and hating hard work. Out of all of these preceding traits, it is not difficult to imagine how the giant Abraham came to be inflexible of purpose and strong of will, though indolent, why he was good-natured to excess in his excess of strength, and why he was a great humorist, and at the same time a melancholy man. It should be remembered by the reader that the state of society in which Abraham Lincoln was born and grew up resembled nothing now existing in Europe, and that it is very imperfectly understood even by many town-dwelling Americans. The people around him were all poor and ignorant, yet they bore their poverty lightly, were hardly aware of their want of culture, and were utterly unconscious of owing the least respect or deference to any human being. Some among them were, of course, aware of the advantages to be derived from wealth and political power, but the majority knew not how to spend the one, and were indifferent to the other. Even to this day there are, in the South and Southwest, scores of thousands of men who, owning vast tracts of fertile land, and gifted with brains and muscle, will not take the pains to build themselves homes better than the ordinary cabins, or cultivate more soil than will supply life with plain and unvaried sustenance. The only advantage they have is the inestimable one, if treated properly, of being free from all trammels save those of ignorance. To rightly appreciate the good or evil qualities of men molded in such society requires great generosity and great freedom from all that is conventional. Within the first few years of her married life, Nancy Hanks Lincoln bore her husband 3 children. The first was a daughter named Sarah, who married at 15 and died soon after. The second was Abraham, and the third Thomas, who died in infancy. The family were always wretchedly poor, even below the level of their neighbors in want, and as the father was indolent, the wife was obliged to labor and suffer. But it is probable that Miss Lincoln, who could read, and Thomas, who attributed his failure in life to ignorance, wished their children to be educated. Schools were, of course, scarce in a country where the houses were often many miles apart. Zechariah Riney, a Catholic priest, was Abraham's first teacher. His next was Caleb Hazel. The young pupil learned to read and write in a few weeks, but in all his life, reckoning his instruction by days, he only had 1 year's schooling. When Thomas Lincoln was first married, 1806, he took his wife to live in Elizabethtown, in a wretched shed, which has since been used as a slaughter-house and stable. About a year after, he removed to Nolan's Creek. 4 years after the birth of Abraham, 1809, he again migrated to a more picturesque and fertile place, a few miles distant on Knob Creek. Here he remained 4 years, and though he was the occupant of over 200 acres of good land, never cultivated more than a little patch, being satisfied with milk and meal for food. When his children went to school, they walked 8 miles, going and returning, having only maize bread for dinner. In 1816, the father, after having sold his interest in the farm for 10 barrels of whiskey and $20, built himself a crazy flatboat and set sail alone on the Ohio, seeking for a new home. By accident, the boat foundered, and much of the cargo was lost, but Thomas Lincoln pushed on, and found a fitting place to settle in Indiana, near the spot on which the village of Gentryville now stands. It was in the untrodden wilderness, and here he soon after brought his family, to live for the first year in what is called a half-faced camp, or a rough hut of poles, of which only 3 sides were enclosed, the 4th being open to the air. In 1817, Betsy Sparrow, an aunt of Mrs. Lincoln, and her husband Thomas, with a nephew named Dennis Hanks, joined the Lincolns, who were moved to a better house, if that could be called a house, which was built of rough logs, and had neither floor, door, nor window. For 2 years they continued to live in this manner. Lincoln, a carpenter, was too lazy to make himself the simplest furniture. They had a few 3-legged stools. The only bed was made in a singular manner. Its head and one side were formed by a corner of the cabin. The bed post was a single crotch cut from the forest. Laid upon this crotch were the ends of 2 hickory poles, whose other extremities were placed in 2 holes made in the logs of the wall. On these sticks rested slats, or boards rudely split from trees with an axe, and on these slats was laid a bag filled with dried leaves. This was the bed of Thomas and Nancy Lincoln, and into it, when the skins hung at the cabin entrance did not keep out the cold, little Abraham and his sister crept for warmth. Very little is recorded of the childhood of the future president. He was once nearly drowned in a stream, and when 8 years of age, shot a wild turkey which, he declared in after life, was the largest game he had ever killed. A remarkable statement for a man who had grown up in a deer country, where buckskin formed the common material for clothing, and venison hams passed for money. One thing is at least certain, that, till he was 10 years old, the poor boy was ill-clad, dirty, and ill-used by his father. He had, however, learned to write. In 1818, a terrible but common epidemic, known in Western America as the milk fever, broke out in Indiana, and within a few days Thomas and Betsy Sparrow and Mrs. Lincoln all died. They had no medical attendance, and it was 9 months before a clergyman, named David Elkin, invited by the first letter which Abraham ever wrote, came 100 miles to hold the funeral service and preach over the graves. Strange as it may seem, the event which is universally regarded as the saddest of every life, in the case of Abraham Lincoln, led directly to greater happiness, and to a change which conduced to the development of all his better qualities. 13 months after the death of Nancy Lincoln, Thomas married a widow, Mrs. Johnston, whom he had wooed ineffectively in Kentucky when she was Miss Sally Bush. She was a woman of sense, industrious, frugal, and gifted with a pride which inspired her to lead a far more civilized life than that which satisfied poor Tom Lincoln. He had greatly exaggerated to her the advantages of his home in Indiana, and she was bitterly disappointed when they reached it. Fortunately, she owned a stock of good furniture, which greatly astonished little Abraham and Sarah and their cousin Dennis. She set about mending matters with great energy, and made her husband put down a floor and hang windows and doors. It was in the depth of winter, and the children, as they nestled in the warm beds she had provided, enjoying the strange luxury of security from the cold winds of December, must have thanked her from the depths of their hearts. She had brought a son and 2 daughters of her own, but Abraham and his sister had an equal place in her affections. They were half naked, and she clad them. They were dirty, and she washed them. They had been ill-used, and she treated them with motherly tenderness. In her own language, she made them look a little more human. This excellent woman loved Abraham tenderly, and her love was warmly returned. After his death she declared to Mr. Herndon, "I can say what not one mother in 10,000 can of a boy. Abe never gave me a cross look, and never refused, in fact or appearance, to do anything I requested him. Nor did I ever give him a cross word in all my life. His mind and mine, what little I had, seemed to run together. He was dutiful to me always. Abe was the best boy I ever saw, or ever expect to see." When in after years Mr. Lincoln spoke of his saintly mother, and of his angel of a mother, he referred to this noble woman, who first made him feel like a human being, whose goodness first touched his childish heart, and taught him that blows and taunts and degradation were not to be his only portion in the world. And if it be recorded of George Washington that he never told a lie, it should also be remembered of Abraham Lincoln, who carried his country safely through a greater crisis than that of the Revolutionary War, that he always obeyed his mother. Abraham had gone to school only a few weeks in Kentucky, and Mrs. Lincoln soon sent him again to receive instruction. His first teacher in Indiana was Hazel Dorsey, his next Andrew Crawford. The latter, in addition to the ordinary branches of education, also taught manners. One scholar would be introduced by another, while walking round the log schoolroom, to all the boys and girls, taught to bow properly, and otherwise acquire the ordinary courtesies of life. Abraham distinguished himself in spelling, which has always been a favorite subject for competition in rural America, and he soon began to write short original articles, though composition formed no part of the studies. It was characteristic of the boy that his first essays were against cruelty to animals. His mates were in the habit of catching the box turtles, or land terrapins, or tortoises, and putting live coals on their backs to make them walk, which greatly annoyed Abraham. All who knew him, in boyhood or in later life, bear witness that this tenderness was equal to his calm courage and tremendous physical strength. The last school which he attended for a short time, and to reach which he walked every day 9 miles, was kept by a Mr. Swaney. This was in 1826. Abraham was now 16 years of age, and had grown so rapidly that he had almost attained the height which he afterwards reached of 6 feet 4 inches. He was very dark, his skin was shriveled even in boyhood by constant exposure, and he habitually wore low shoes, a linsey-woolsey shirt, a cap made from the skin of a raccoon or possum, and buckskin breeches, which were invariably about 12 inches too short for him. When not working for his father, he was hired out as a farm laborer to the neighbors. His cousin, John Hanks, says, "We worked barefoot, grubbed it, plowed, mowed, and cradled together." All who knew him at this time testify that Abraham hated hard work, though he did it well, that he was physically indolent, though intellectually very active, that he loved to laugh, tell stories, and joke while laboring, and that he passed his leisure moments in hard study or in reading, which he made hard by writing out summaries of all he read, and getting them by heart. He would study arithmetic at night by the light of the fire, and cipher or copy with a pencil or coal on the wooden shovel or on a board. When this was full, he would shave it off with his father's drawing knife, and begin again. When he had paper, he used it instead, but in the frequent intervals when he had none, the boards were kept until paper was obtained. Among the first books which he read and thoroughly mastered were Aesop's Fables, Robinson Crusoe, Bunyan's Pilgrim's Process, a History of the United States, Weem's Life of Washington, and the Revised Statutes of Indiana. From another work, The Kentucky Preceptor, a collection of literary extracts, he is said by a Mrs. Crawford, who knew him well, to have learned his school orations, speeches, and pieces to write. The field work, which Abraham Lincoln disliked, did not, however, exhaust his body, and his mind found relief after toil in mastering anything in print. It is not unusual to see poor and ignorant youths, who are determined to get learning, apply themselves to the hardest and driest intellectual labor with very little discrimination of any difference between that and more attractive literature, and it is evident that young Lincoln worked in this spirit. There is no proof that his memory was by nature extraordinary. It would rather seem that the contrary was the case, from the pains which he took to improve it. During his boyhood, any book had to him all the charm of rarity. Perhaps it was the more charming because most of his friends believed that mental culture was incompatible with industry. Lincoln, said his cousin Dennis Hanks, was lazy, a very lazy man. He was always reading, scribbling, writing, ciphering, writing poetry, and the like. It is evident that his custom of continually exercising his memory on all subjects grew with his growth and strengthened with his strength. By the time he was 25, he had, without instruction, made himself a good lawyer, not a mere case practitioner, but one who argued from a sound knowledge of principles. It is said that when he began to read Blackstone, he thoroughly learned the first 40 pages at one sitting. There is also sufficient proof that he had perfectly mastered not only Euclid's geometry, but a number of elementary scientific works, among others one on astronomy. And many anecdotes of his later life prove that he had learned nothing without thinking it over deeply, especially in all its relations to his other acquisitions and its practical use. If education consists of mental discipline and the acquisition of knowledge, it is idle to say that Abraham Lincoln was uneducated, since few college graduates actually excelled him in either respect. These facts deserve dwelling on, since, in the Golden Book of Self-Made Men, there is not one who presents a more encouraging example to youth, and especially to the poor and ambitious, than Abraham Lincoln. He developed his memory by resolutely training it. He brought out his reasoning powers as a lawyer by using his memory. He became a fluent speaker and a ready reasoner by availing himself to every opportunity to speak or debate. From the facts which have been gathered by his biographers, or which are current in conversation among those who knew him, it is most evident that there seldom lived a man who owed so little to innate genius or talents in comparison to what he achieved by sheer determination and perseverance. When Abraham was 15 or 16, he began to exercise his memory in a new direction, by frequenting not only religious but political meetings, and by mounting the stump of a tree the day after, and repeating with great accuracy all he had heard. It is said that he mimicked with great skill not only the tones of preachers and orators, but also their gestures and facial expressions. Anything like cruelty to man or beast would always inspire him to an original address, in which he would preach vigorously against inflicting pain. Wherever he spoke, an audience was sure to assemble, and as this frequently happened in the harvest field, the youthful orator or actor was often dragged down by his angry father and driven to his work. His wit and humor, his inexhaustible fund of stories, and, above all, his kind heart, made him everywhere a favorite. Women, says Mr. Lamon, were especially pleased, for he was always ready to do any kind of work for them, such as chopping wood, making a fire, or nursing a baby. Any family was glad when he was hired to work with them, since he did his work well, and made them all merry while he was about it. In 1825, he was employed by James Taylor as a ferryman, to manage a boat which crossed the Ohio and Anderson's Creek. In addition to this, he worked on the farm, acted as hostler, ground corn, built the fires, put the water early on the fire, and prepared for the mistress's cooking. Though he was obliged to rise so early, he always studied till nearly midnight. He was in great demand when hogs were slaughtered. For this rough work he was paid 31 cents, about $16 a day. Meanwhile he became incredibly strong. He could carry 600 pounds with ease. He once picked up some huge posts which 4 men were about to lift, and bore them away with little effort. Men yet alive have seen him lift a full barrel of liquor and drink from the bunghole. He could sink an axe, said an old friend, deeper into wood than any man I ever saw. He was especially skilled in wrestling, and from the year 1828 there was no man, far or near, who would compete with him in it. From his boyhood he was extremely temperate. Those who have spoken most freely about his faults admit that, in a country where a whiskey jug was kept in every house, Lincoln never touched spirits except to avoid giving offense. His stepmother thought he was temperate to a fault. Meanwhile, as the youth grew apace, the neighboring village of Gentryville had grown with him. Books and cultivated society became more accessible. The great man of the place was a Mr. Jones, the shopkeeper, whose shop supplied all kinds of goods required by farmers. Mr. Jones took a liking to young Lincoln, employed him sometimes, taught him politics, giving him deep impressions in favor of Andrew Jackson, the representative of the Democratic Party, and finally awoke Abraham's ambition by admiring him, and predicting that he would some day be a great man. Another friend was John Baldwin, the village blacksmith, who was, even for a Western American wag, wonderfully clever at a jest, and possessed of an inexhaustible fund of stories. It was from John Baldwin that Lincoln derived a great number of the quaint anecdotes with which he was accustomed in after years to illustrate his arguments. His memory contained thousands of these drolleries, so that, eventually, there was no topic of conversation which did not put him in mind of a little story. In some other respects, his acquisitions were less useful. Though he knew a vast number of ballads, he could not sing one, and though a reader of Burns, certain of his own satires and songs, levelled at some neighbours who had slighted him, were mere doggerel, wanting every merit, and very bitter. But, about 1827, he contributed an article on temperance and another on American politics to two newspapers published in Ohio. From the praise awarded by a lawyer named Bichard to the political article, it would appear to have been very well written. Even in this first essay in politics, Lincoln urged the principle by which he became famous and for which he died, adherence to the Constitution and the integrity of the American Union. In March 1828, Abraham Lincoln was hired by Mr. Gentry, the proprietor of Gentryville, as bowhand, and to work the front oars, on a boat going with a cargo of bacon to New Orleans. This was a trip of 1,800 miles, and then, as now, the life of an Ohio and Mississippi boatman was full of wild adventure. One incident which befell the future president was sufficiently strange. Having arrived at a sugar plantation 6 miles below Baton Rouge, the boat was poled in, and Lincoln, with his companion, a son of Mr. Gentry, went to sleep. Hearing footsteps in the night, they sprang up and saw that a gang of 7 negroes were coming on board to rob or murder. Seizing a handspike, Lincoln rushed towards them, and as the leader jumped on the boat, knocked him into the water. The second, third, and fourth, as they leapt aboard, were served in the same way, and the others fled, but were pursued by Lincoln and Gentry, who inflicted on them a severe beating. In this encounter, Abraham received a wound the scar of which he bore through life. It is very probable that among these negroes who would have taken the life of the future champion of emancipation, there were some who lived to share its benefits and weep for his death. It was during this voyage, or about this time, that 2 strangers paid Abraham half a silver dollar each for rowing them ashore in a boat. Relating this to Mr. Seward, Secretary of State, he said, "You may think it was a very little thing, but it was a most important incident in my life. I could scarcely believe that I, a poor boy, had earned $1 in less than a day. I was a more hopeful and confident being from that time." End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2. In 1830, Thomas Lincoln had again tired of his home, and resolved to move westward. This time he did not change without good reason. An epidemic had appeared in his Indiana neighborhood, which was besides generally unhealthy. Therefore, in the spring, he and Abraham, with Dennis Hanks and Levi Hall, who had married one of Mrs. Lincoln's daughters by her first husband, with their families, 13 in all, having packed their furniture on a wagon drawn by 4 oxen, took the road for Illinois. After journeying 200 miles in 15 days, Thomas Lincoln settled in Moron County, on the Sangamon River, about 10 miles west of Decatur. Here they built a cabin of hewn timber, with a smokehouse for drying meat, and a stable, and broke up and fenced 15 acres of land. Abraham Lincoln was now 21, and his father had been a hard master, taking all his wages. He therefore, after doing his best to settle the family in their new home, went forth to work for himself among the farmers. One George Cluse, who worked with Abraham during the first year in Illinois, says that at that time he was the roughest-looking person he ever saw. He was tall, angular, and ungainly, and wore trousers of flax and tow, cut tight at the ankle and out at the knees. He was very poor, and made a bargain with Miss Nancy Miller to split 400 rails for every yard of brown jean, dyed with walnut bark, that would be required to make him a pair of trousers. Thomas Lincoln found, in less than a year, that his new home was the most unhealthy of all he had tried. So he went westward again, moving to 3 new places until he settled at Goose Nest Prairie, in Coles County, where he died at the age of 73, as usual, in debt. From the time of his death, and as he advanced in prosperity, Abraham aided his stepmother in many ways besides sending her money. It was at Decatur that he made his first public speech, standing on a keg. It was on the navigation of the Sangamon River, and was delivered extemporaneously in reply to one by a candidate for the legislature named Posey. During the winter of 1831, a trader named Denton Offutt proposed to John Hanks, Abraham Lincoln, and John D. Johnston, his stepmother's son, to take a flatboat to New Orleans. The wages offered were very high, 50 cents a day to each man, and $60 to be divided among them at the end of the trip. After some delay, the boat, loaded with corn, pigs, and pork, sailed, but just below New Salem, on the Sangamon, it stuck on a dam, but was saved by the great ingenuity of Lincoln, who invented a novel apparatus for getting it over. This seems to have turned his mind to the subject of overcoming such difficulties of navigation, and in 1849 he obtained a patent for an improved method of lifting vessels over shoals. The design is a bellows attached to each side of the hull, below the waterline, to be pumped full of air when it is desired to lift the craft over a shoal. The model, which is 18 or 20 inches long, and which is now in the Patent Office at Washington, appears to have been cut with a knife from a shingle in a cigar box. John Hanks, apparently a most trustworthy and excellent man, declared that it was during this trip, while at New Orleans, Lincoln first saw negroes chained, maltreated, and whipped. It made a deep impression on his humane mind, and, years after, he often declared that witnessing this cruelty first induced him to think slavery wrong. At New Orleans, the flatboat discharged its cargo and was sold for its timber. Lincoln returned on a steamboat to St. Louis, and thence walked home. He had hardly returned before he received a challenge from a famous wrestler named Daniel Needham. There was a great assembly at Wabash Point to witness the match, where Needham was thrown with so much ease that his pride was more hurt than his body. In July 1831, Abraham again engaged himself to Mr. Offutt to take charge of a county store in New Salem. While awaiting his employer, an election was held, and a clerk was wanted at the polls. The stranger, Abraham, being asked whether he was competent to fill the post, said, "I will try," and performed the duties well. This was the first public official act of his life, and as soon as Offutt's goods arrived, Lincoln, from a day laborer, became a clerk, or rather salesman, in which capacity he remained for 1 year, or until the spring of 1832, when his employer failed. Many incidents are narrated of Lincoln's honesty towards customers during this clerkship, of his strict integrity in trifles, his bravery when women were annoyed by bullies, and of his prowess against a gang of ruffians who infested and ruled the town. He is said to have more than once walked several miles after business hours to return 6 cents, or some equally trifling sum, when he had been overpaid. It is very evident that he managed all matters with so much tact as to make fast friends of everybody, and was specially a favorite of the men with whom he fought. It was now that he began to cultivate popularity, quietly, but with the same determination which he had shown in acquiring knowledge. To his credit be it said, that he effected this neither by flattery nor servility, but by making the most of his good qualities, and by inducing respect for his honesty, intelligence, and bravery. It is certain that, during a year, Mr. Offutt was continually stimulating his ambition, and insisting he knew more than any man in the United States, and would some day be president. Lincoln himself knew very well by this time of what stuff many of the men were made who rose in politics, and that, with a little luck and perseverance, he could hold his own with them. When out of the store, he was always busy, as of old, in the pursuit of knowledge. He mastered the English grammar, remarking that, if that was what they called a science, he thought he could subdue another. A Mr. Green, who became his fellow clerk, declares that his talk now showed that he was beginning to think of a great life and a great destiny. He busied himself very much with debating clubs, walking many miles to attend them, and for years continued to take the Louisville Journal, famous for the lively wit of its editor, George D. Prentice, and for this newspaper he paid regularly when he had not the means to buy decent clothing. From this time his life rapidly increases in interest. It is certain that, from early youth, he had quietly determined to become great, and that he thoroughly tested his own talents and acquirements before entering upon politics as a career. His chief and indeed his almost only talent was resolute perseverance, and by means of it he passed in the race of life thousands who were his superiors in genius. Among all the biographies of the great and wise and good among mankind, there is not one so full of encouragement to young poor men as that of Abraham Lincoln, since there is not one which so illustrates not only how mere personal success may be attained, but how by strong will and self-culture the tremendous task of guiding a vast country through the trials of a civil war may be successfully achieved. In the spring of 1832, Mr. Offutt failed, and Lincoln had nothing to do. For some time past, an Indian rebellion, led by the famous Black Hawk, chief of the Sac tribe, had caused the greatest alarm in the western states. About the beginning of this century, 1804 through 1805, the Sacs had been removed west of the Mississippi, but Black Hawk, believing that his people had been unjustly exiled, organized a conspiracy for which a while embraced 9 of the most powerful tribes of the Northwest, and announced his intention of returning and settling in the old hunting grounds of his people on the Rock River. He was a man of great courage and shrewdness, skilled as an orator, and dreaded as one gifted with supernatural power, combining in his person the war chief and prophet. But the returning Indians, by committing great barbarities on the way, caused such irritation and alarm among the white settlers that when Governor Reynolds of Illinois issued a call for volunteers, several regiments of hardy frontiersmen were at once formed. Black Hawk's allies, with the exception of the tribe of the Foxes, at once fell away, but their desperate leader kept on in his course. Among the companies which volunteered was one from Menard County, embracing many men from New Salem. The captain was chosen by vote, and the choice fell on Lincoln. He was accustomed to say, when president, that nothing in his life had ever gratified him so much as this promotion. And this may well have been, since, to a very ambitious man, the first practical proofs of popularity are like the first installment of a great fortune paid to one who is poor. Though he was never in an actual engagement during this campaign, Lincoln underwent much hunger and hardship while it lasted, and at times had great trouble with his men, who were not only mere raw militia, but also unusually rough and rebellious. One incident of the war, however, as narrated by Lamon, not only indicates that Abraham Lincoln was sometimes in danger, but was well qualified to grapple with it. One day, during these many marches and countermarches, an old Indian, weary, hungry, and helpless, found his way into the camp. He professed to be a friend of the whites, and although it was an exceedingly perilous experiment for one of his color, he ventured to throw himself upon the mercy of the soldiers. But the men first murmured, and then broke out into fierce cries for his blood. "We have come out to fight Indians," they said, "and we intend to do it." The poor Indian, now in the extremity of his distress and peril, did what he should have done before. He threw down before his assailants a soiled and crumpled paper, which he implored them to read before taking his life. It was a letter of character and safe conduct from General Cass, pronouncing him a faithful man, who had done good service in the cause for which this army was enlisted. But it was too late. The men refused to read it, or thought it a forgery, and were rushing with fury upon the defenseless old savage, when Captain Lincoln bounded between them and their appointed victim. "Men," said he, and his voice for a moment stilled the agitation around him, "this must not be done. He must not be shot and killed by us." "But," said some of them, "the Indian is a spy." Lincoln knew that his own life was now in only less danger than that of the poor creature that crouched behind him. During this scene, the towering form and the passion and resolution in Lincoln's face produced an effect upon the furious mob. They paused, listened, fell back, and then sullenly obeyed what seemed to be the voice of reason as well as authority. But there were still some murmurs of disappointed rage, and half-suppressed exclamations which looked towards vengeance of some kind. At length one of the men, a little bolder than the rest, but evidently feeling that he spoke for the whole, cried out, "This is cowardly on your part, Lincoln. If any man think I am a coward, let him test it," was the reply. "Lincoln," responded a new voice, "you are larger and heavier than we are." "This you can guard against. Choose your weapons," returned the captain. Whatever may be said of Mr. Lincoln's choice of means for the preservation of military discipline, it was certainly very effectual in this case. There was no more disaffection in his camp, and the word coward was never coupled with his name again. Mr. Lincoln understood his men better than those who would be disposed to criticize his conduct. He has often declared himself that his life and character were both at stake, and would probably have been lost, had he not at that supremely critical moment forgotten the officer and asserted the man. The soldiers, in fact, could not have been arrested, tried, or punished. They were merely wild backwoodsmen, acting entirely by their own will, and any effort to court-martial them would simply have failed in its object, and made their captain seem afraid of them. During this campaign, Lincoln made the acquaintance of a lawyer, then captain, the Hon. T. Stewart, who had subsequently a great influence on his career. When the company was mustered out in May, Lincoln at once re-enlisted as a private in a volunteer spy company, where he remained for a month until the Battle of Bad Axe, which resulted in the capture of Black Hawk, put an end to hostilities. This war was not a remarkable affair, says J. G. Holland, but it was remarkable in that the two simplest, homeliest, and truest men engaged in it afterwards became Presidents of the United States, namely General, then Colonel, Zachary Taylor, and Abraham Lincoln. It has always been usual in the United States to urge to the utmost the slightest military services rendered by candidates for office. The absurd degree to which this was carried often awoke the satire of Lincoln, even when it was at his own expense. Many years after, he referred thus humorously to his military services. "By the way, Mr. Speaker, did you know I was a military hero? Yes, sir. In the days of the Black Hawk War I fought, bled, and came away. Speaking of General Cass's career reminds me of my own. I was not at Sullivan's defeat, but I was about as near to it as Cass was to Hull's surrender, and, like him, I saw the place soon after. It is quite certain that I did not break my sword, for I had none to break, but I bent my musket pretty bad on one occasion. If Cass broke his sword, the idea is he broke it in desperation. I bent the musket by accident. If General Cass went in advance of me in picking whortleberries, I guess I surpass him in charges upon the wild onions. If he saw any live fighting Indians, it was more than I did, but I had a great many bloody struggles with the mosquitoes, and, although I never fainted from loss of blood, I certainly can say I was often very hungry." The soldiers from Sangamon County arrived home just 10 days before the state election, and Lincoln was immediately applied to for permission to place his name among the candidates for the legislature. He canvassed the district, but was defeated, though he received the almost unanimous vote of his own precinct. The young man had, however, made a great advance even by defeat, since he became known by it as one whose sterling honesty had deserved a better reward. Lincoln's integrity was, in this election, strikingly evinced by his adherence to his political principles. Had he been less scrupulous, he would not have lost the election. At this time there were two great political parties, the Democratic, headed by Andrew Jackson, elected president in 1832, and that which had been the Federalist, but which was rapidly being called Whig. The Democratic Party warred against a national bank, paper money, monopolies, or privileged and chartered institutions, a protective tariff, and internal improvements, and was, in short, jealous of all public expenditure which could tend to greatly enrich individuals. Its leader, Jackson, was a man of inflexible determination and unquestionable bravery, which he had shown not only in battle, but by subduing the incipient rebellion in South Carolina, when that state had threatened to nullify or secede from the Union. Lincoln's heart was with Jackson. He had unbounded admiration for the man, but he knew that the country needed internal improvements, and in matters of political economy, inclined to the Whigs. After returning from the army, he went to live in the house of W. H. Herndon, a most estimable man, to whose researches the world owes nearly all that is known of Lincoln's early life and family, and who was subsequently his law partner. At this time the late captain thought of becoming a blacksmith, but as an opportunity occurred of buying a store in New Salem on credit, he became in company with a man named Barry, a country merchant or trader. He showed little wisdom in associating himself with Barry, who proved a drunkard and ruined the business, after a year of anxiety, leaving Lincoln in debt, which he struggled to pay off through many years of trouble. It was not until 1849 that the last note was discharged. His creditors were, however, considerate and kind. While living with Mr. Herndon, Lincoln began to study law seriously. He had previously read Blackstone, and by one who has really mastered this grand compendium of English law, the profession is already half acquired. He was still very poor, and appears to have lived by helping a Mr. Ellis in his shop, and to have received much willing aid from friends, especially John T. Stuart, who always cheerfully supplied his wants, and lent him law books. About this time, Lincoln attracted the attention of a noted Democrat, John Calhoun, the surveyor of Sangamon County, who afterwards became famous as president of the Lecompton Council in Kansas during the disturbances between friends and opponents of slavery prior to the admission of the state. He liked Lincoln, and, wanting a really honest assistant, recommended him to learn surveying, lending him a book for the purpose. In 6 weeks he had qualified himself, and soon acquired a small private business. On the 7th May, 1833, Lincoln was appointed postmaster at New Salem. As the mail arrived but once a week, neither the duties or emoluments of the office were such as to greatly disturb or delight him. He is said, indeed, to have kept the letters in his hat, being at once, in his own person, both office and officer. The advantages which he gained were opportunities to read the newspapers, which he did aloud to the assembled inhabitants, and to decipher letters for all who could not read. All of this was conducive, in a creditable way, to notoriety and popularity, and he improved it as such. In the autumn of 1834 a great trouble occurred. His scanty property, consisting of the horse, saddle, bridle, and surveyor's instruments by which he lived, were seized under a judgment on one of the notes which he had given for the store. But two good friends, named Short and Bowlin Green, bought them in for $245, which Lincoln faithfully repaid in due time. It is said that he was an accurate surveyor, and remarkable for his truthfulness. He never speculated in lands, nor availed himself of endless opportunities to profit by aiding the speculations of others. Miserably poor and badly clad, Lincoln, though very fond of the society of women, was sensitive and shy when they were strangers. Mr. Ellis, the storekeeper for whom he often worked, states that, when he lived with him at the tavern, there came a lady from Virginia with 3 stylish daughters, who remained a few weeks. During their stay, I do not remember Mr. Lincoln ever eating at the same table where they did. I thought it was on account of his awkward appearance and wearing apparel. There are many anecdotes recorded of this kind, showing at this period his poverty, his popularity, and his kindness of heart. He was referee, umpire, and unquestioned judge in all disputes, horse races, or wagers. One who knew him in this capacity said of him, "He is the fairest man I ever had to deal with." In 1834, Lincoln again became a successful candidate for the Legislature of Illinois, receiving a larger majority than any other candidate on the ticket. A friend, Colonel Smoot, lent him $200 to make a decent appearance, and he went to the seat of government properly dressed, for, perhaps, the first time in his life. During the session he said very little, but worked hard and learned much. He was on the Committee for Public Accounts and Expenditures, and when the session was at an end, quietly walked back to his work. Lamon relates, at full length, that at this time Lincoln was in love with a young lady, who died of a broken heart in 1835, not, however, for Lincoln, but for another young man, who had been engaged to and abandoned her. At her death, Lincoln seemed for some weeks nearly insane, and was never the same man again. From this time he lost his youth, and became subject to frequent attacks of intense mental depression, resulting in that settled melancholy which never left him. In 1836 he was again elected to the Legislature. Political excitement at this time ran high. The country was being settled rapidly, and people's minds were wild with speculation in lands and public works, from which every man hoped for wealth, and which were to be developed by the legislatures. Lincoln's colleagues were in an unusual degree able men, and the session was a busy one. It was during the canvass of 1836 that he made his first really great speech. He had by this time fairly joined the new Whig party, and it was in reply to a Democrat, Dr. Early, that he spoke. From that day he was recognized as one of the most powerful orators in the state. The principal object of this session, in accordance with the popular mania, was internal improvements, and to this subject Lincoln had been devoted for years. The representatives from Sangamon County consisted of 9 men of great influence, every one at least 6 feet in height, whence they were known as the Long Nine. The friends of the adoption of a general system of internal improvements wished to secure the aid of the Long Nine, but the latter refused to aid them unless the removal of the capital of the state from Vandalia to Springfield should be made part of the measure. The result was that both the bill for removal and that for internal improvements, involving the indebtedness of the state for many millions of dollars, passed the same day. Lincoln was the leader in these improvements and was a most laborious member, instant in season and out of season, for the great measures of the Whig party. At the present day, though grave doubts may exist as to the expediency of such reckless and radical legislation, there can be none as to the integrity or good faith of Abraham Lincoln. He did not enrich himself by it, though it is not impossible that, in legislation as in land surveying, others swindled on his honesty. It was during this session that Lincoln first beheld Stephen Douglas, who was destined to become, for 20 years, his most formidable opponent. Douglas, from his diminutive stature and great mind, was afterwards popularly known as the Little Giant. Lincoln merely recorded his first impressions of Douglas by saying he was the least man he ever saw. This legislation of 1836 to 37 was indeed of a nature to attract speculators, whether in finance or politics. Within a few days, it passed 2 loans amounting to $12 million, and chartered 1,300 miles of railway, with canals, bridges, and river improvements in full proportion. The capital stock of 2 banks was increased by nearly $5 million, which the state took, leaving it to the banks to manage the railroad and canal funds. Everything was undertaken on a colossal and daring scale by the legislatures, who were principally managed by the Long Nine, who were in their turn chiefly directed by Lincoln. The previous session had been to him only as the green room in which to prepare himself for the stage. When he made his first appearance in the political ballet, it was certainly with such a great leap as had never before been witnessed in any beginner. The internal improvement scheme involved not only great boldness and promptness in its execution, but also a vast amount of that practical business talent in which most Western men and Yankees were instinctively proficient. With all this, there was incessant hard work and great excitement. Through the turmoil, Lincoln passed like one in his true element. He had at last gotten into the life which he aspired for years, and was probably as happy as his constitutional infirmity of melancholy would permit. He was, it is true, no man of business in the ordinary sense, but he understood the general principles of business, and was skilled in availing himself in others of talents which he did not possess. During this session he put on record his first anti-slavery protest. It was, in the words of Lamon, a very mild beginning, but it required uncommon courage, and is interesting as indicating the principle upon which his theory of emancipation was afterwards carried out. At this time the whole country, North as well as South, was becoming excited concerning the doctrines and practices of the small but very rapidly growing body of abolitionists, who were attacking slavery with fiery zeal, and provoking in return the most deadly hatred. The abolitionist, carrying the Republican theory to its logical extreme, insisted that all men, white or black, were entitled to the same political and social rights. The slave owners honestly believed that society should consist of strata, the lowest of which should be bondmen. The abolitionists did not recognize that slavery in America, like serfdom in Russia, had developed into a culture a country which would, without it, have remained a wilderness. nor did the slave theorists recognize that a time must infallibly come when both systems of enforced labor must yield to new forms of industrial development. The abolitionists, taking their impressions from the early English and Quaker philanthropists, thought principally of the personal wrong inflicted on the Negro, while the majority of Americans declared, with equal conviction, that the blacks' sufferings were not so much account that white man should be made to suffer much more for them, and the whole country be possibly overwhelmed in civil war. Even at this early period of the dispute, there were, however, in the old Whig party, a few men who thought that the growing strife was not to be stopped simply by crushing the abolitionists. But while they would have gladly seen the latter abate their furious zeal, they also thought that slavery might, with propriety, be at least checked in its progress, since they had observed, with grave misgiving, that wherever it was planted, only an aristocracy flourished, while the poor white men became utterly degraded. Such were the views of Abraham Lincoln, views which, in after years, led, during the sharp and bitter need of the war, to the formation of the theory of emancipation for the sake of the country, as opposed to mere abolition for the sake of the Negro, which had had its turn and fulfilled its mission. The feeling against the abolitionists were very bitter in Illinois. Many other states had passed severe resolutions, recommending that anti-slavery agitation be made an indictable offense or a misdemeanor, and, in May 1836, Congress declared that all future abolition petitions should be laid on the table without discussion. But when the Legislature of Illinois took its turn in the fashion, and passed resolutions of the same kind, Abraham Lincoln presented to the House a protest which he could get but one man, Dan Stone, to sign. Perhaps he did not want any more signatures, for he was one of those who foresaw to what this cloud, no larger than a man's hand, would in future years extend, and was willing to be alone as a prophet. The protest was as follows. March 3rd, 1837. The following protest was presented to the House, which was read and ordered to be spread on the journals, to wit: Resolutions upon the subject of domestic slavery, having passed both branches of the General Assembly at its present session, the undersigned hereby protest against the passage of the same. They believe that the institution of slavery is founded on both injustice and bad policy, but that the promulgation of abolition doctrines tends rather to increase than abate its evils. They believe that the Congress of the United States has no power under the Constitution to interfere with the institution of slavery in the different states. They believe that the Congress of the United States has the power, under the Constitution, to abolish slavery in the District of Columbia, but that the power ought not to be exercised unless at the request of the people of the district. The difference between these opinions and those contained in the said resolutions is their reason for entering this protest. Signed, Dan Stone, Abraham Lincoln, representatives from the county of Sangamon. This was indeed a very mild protest, but it was the beginning of that which, in after years, grew to be the real emancipation of the Negro. Never in history was so fine an end of the wedge succeeded by such a wide cleaving bulk. Much as Lincoln afterwards accomplished for the abolition of slavery, he never, says Holland, became more extreme in his views than the words of this protest intimate. It was during this session also that he first put himself in direct opposition to Douglas by another protest. The Democrats, in order to enable the aliens, virtually the Irishmen, in their state to vote on 6 months' residence, passed a bill known as the Douglas Bill, remodeling the judiciary in such a way as to secure judges who would aid them. Against this, Lincoln, E.D. Baker, and others protested vigorously, but without avail. Both of these protests, though failures at the time, were in reality the beginnings of two great principles which led to Lincoln's great success, and the realization of his utmost ambition. During his life, defeat was always a step to victory. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3. Abraham Lincoln's career was now clear. He was to follow the law for a living, as a step to political eminence. And as the seat of state government was henceforth to be at Springfield, he determined to live where both law and politics might be followed to the greatest advantage, since it was in Springfield that, in addition to the state courts, the circuit and district courts of the United States sat. He obtained his license as an attorney in 1837 and commenced his practice in the March of that year. He entered into partnership with his friend, J.T. Stewart, and lived with the Honorable W. Butler, who was of great assistance to him in the simple matter of living, for he was at this time as poor as ever. During 1837, he delivered several addresses in which there was a strong basis of common sense, though they were fervid and figurative to extravagance, as suited the tastes of his hearers. In these speeches he predicted a great struggle on which the country was about to enter, and that it would never be settled by passion, but by reason. Cold, calculating, unimpassioned reasoning, which must furnish all the materials for our future defense and support. He also distinguished himself in debate and retort, so that ere long he became unrivaled in his sphere in ready eloquence. From this time, for 20 years, he followed his great political rival, Douglas, seeking every opportunity to contend with him. From 1837 he concerned himself little with the politics of his state, but entered with zeal into the higher interests of the Federal Union. In 1840, Lincoln was a candidate for the office of presidential elector on the Harrison ticket, and made speeches through a great part of Illinois. Soon after, he again became involved in a love affair, which, through its perplexities, and the revival of the memory of his early disappointment, had a terrible effect on his mind. He had become intimate with a Mr. Speed, who remained through his life his best friend. For a year he was almost a lunatic, and was taken to Kentucky by Mr. Speed, and kept there until he recovered. It was for this reason that he did not attend the Legislature of 1841 through 1842. It is very characteristic of Lincoln that, from boyhood, he never wanted true friends to aid him in all his troubles. Soon after his recovery, Lincoln became engaged to Miss Mary Todd. This lady was supposed to be gifted as a witty and satirical writer, though it must be admitted that the specimens of her literary capacity, exhibited in certain anonymous contributions to the newspapers, show little talent beyond the art of irritation. Several of these were leveled at a politician named James Shields, an Irishman who, being told that Lincoln had written them, sent him a challenge. The challenge was accepted, but the duel was prevented by mutual friends. Lincoln married Miss Todd on the 4th November, 1842. This marriage, which had not been preceded by the most favorable omens, was followed by a singular misfortune. In 1843, Lincoln was a Whig candidate for Congress, but was defeated. He had a hard time of it, and was compelled to meet accusations of a strange character. Among other things, he was charged with being an aristocrat, and with having deserted his old friends, the people, by marrying a proud woman on account of her blood and family. This hurt him keenly, says Lamon, and he took great pains to disprove it. Other accusations, equally frivolous, relative to his supposed religion or irreligion, also contributed to his defeat. On this much vexed subject of Lincoln's religious faith, or his want of it, something may here be said. In his boyhood, when religious associations were most valuable in disciplining the mind, he had never even seen a church, and, as he grew older, his sense of humor and his rude companions prevented him from being seriously impressed by the fervid but often eccentric oratory of the few itinerant preachers who found their way into the backwoods. At New Salem he had read Volney's Ruins and the works of Thomas Paine, and was for some time a would-be unbeliever. It is easy to trace in his youthful irreligion the influence of irresistible causes. As he grew older, his intensely melancholy and emotional temperament inclined him towards reliance in an unseen providence and belief in a future state. And it is certain that, after the unpopularity of free thinkers had forced itself upon his mind, the most fervidly passionate expressions of piety began to abound in his speeches. In this he was not, however, hypocritical. From his childhood, Abraham Lincoln was possessed even to unreason with the idea that whatever was absolutely popular was founded on reason and right. He was a Republican of Republicans, faithfully believing that whatever average common sense accepted must be followed. His own personal popularity was, at all times, very great. One who knew him testifies that, when the lawyers traveling the judicial court of Illinois arrived at the villages where trials were to be held, crowds of men and women always assembled to welcome Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln himself had a great admiration for Henry Clay. In 1844, he went through Illinois, delivering speeches and debating and speaking, or, as it is called in America, stumping for him, and he even extended his labors into Indiana. It was all in vain, and Clay's defeat was a great blow to Lincoln. At this time, though he withdrew from politics in favor of law, he began to think seriously of getting a seat in Congress. His management of this affair indicates forcibly his entire faith in party right, and his principle of never advancing beyond his party. Of all the men of action known to history as illustrating great epochs, there never was a more thorough man of action than Lincoln, but the brain which inspired his action was always that of the people. Through all his poverty, Lincoln was always just and generous. In 1843, while living with his wife for $4 a week at a country tavern, he gave up a promissory note for a large fee to an impoverished client who, after the trial, had lost a hand. He paid all his own debts, and generously aided his stepmother and other friends. In 1846, Lincoln accepted the nomination for Congress. His Democratic opponent was Peter Cartwright, a celebrated pioneer Methodist preacher. It is a great proof of Lincoln's popularity that he was elected by an unprecedented majority, though he was the only Whig congressman from Illinois. At this session, his almost lifelong adversary, Douglas, took a place in the Senate. Both houses shone with an array of great and brilliant names, and Lincoln, as the only representative of his party from his state, was in a critical and responsible situation. But he was no novice in legislation, and he acquitted himself bravely. He became a member of the Committee on Post Offices and Post Roads, and in that capacity made his first speech. He found it as easy a matter to address his new colleagues as his old clients. "I was about as badly scared," he wrote to W.J. Herndon, "and no worse, as when I speak in court." During this session, the United States were at war with Mexico, and Lincoln was, with his party, in a painful dilemma. They were opposed to the principle of the war, since they detested forcible acquisition of territory, and it was evident that Mexico was wanted by the South to extend the area of slavery. Yet they could not, in humanity, withhold supplies from the army in Mexico while fighting bravely. So Lincoln denounced the war, and yet voted the supplies, an inconsistency creditable to his heart, but which involved him in great trouble with his constituents. But he struck the administration a severe blow in what was really his first speech before the whole House. President Polk having declared in a message that the Mexicans had invaded our territory and shed the blood of our citizens on our own soil, Lincoln introduced what were called the famous spot resolutions, in which the president was invited, in a series of satirical yet serious questions, to indicate the spot where this outrage had been committed. Lincoln was very busy this year. The Whig National Convention was to nominate a candidate for president on the 1st June, and he was to be one of its members. On July 27th he delivered, in Congress, a speech as remarkable in some respects for solid sense and shrewdness as it was in others for eccentric drollery and scathing Western retorts. The second session, 1848-49, was quieter. At one time he proposed, as a substitute for a resolution that slavery be at once abolished by law in the District of Columbia, another, providing that the owners be paid for their slaves. If he did little in this session to attract attention, he made for himself a name, and was known as a powerful speaker and a rising man, but, after returning to Springfield, though a Whig president had been elected, and his own reputation greatly increased, he was thrown out of political employment until the year 1854. He made great efforts to secure the office of Commissioner of the General Land Office, but failed. President Fillmore, it is true, offered him the governorship of Oregon, but Mrs. Lincoln induced him to decline it. In 1850, his friends wished to nominate him for Congress, but he positively refused the honor. It is thought that he wished to establish himself in his profession for the sake of a support for his family, or that he had entered into a secret understanding with other candidates for Congress, who were to nominally oppose each other, but in reality secure election in turn by excluding rivals. But it is most probable that he clearly foresaw at this time the tremendous struggle that was approaching between North and South, and wished to prepare himself for some great part in it. To engage in minor political battles and be defeated, as would probably be the case in his district, where his war vote in Congress was still remembered to his disadvantage, would have seriously injured his future prospects of every kind. He said, in 1850, to his friend Stuart, "The time will come when we must all be Democrats or Abolitionists. When that time comes, my mind is made up. The slavery question can't be compromised." Many interesting anecdotes of Lincoln's legal experiences at this time have been preserved. In his first case, at Springfield, he simply admitted that all laws and precedents were in favor of his opponent, and, having stated them in detail, left the decision to the court. He would never take an unjust or mean or purely litigious case. When retained with a colleague named Swett to defend a man accused of murder, Lincoln became convinced of his client's guilt, and said to his associate, "You must defend him. I cannot." Mr. Swett obtained an acquittal, but Lincoln would take no part of the large fee which was paid. On one occasion, however, when one of his own friends of boyhood, John Armstrong, was indicted for a very atrocious murder, Lincoln, moved by the tears and entreaties of the aged mother of the prisoner, consented to plead his cause. It having been testified that, when the man was murdered, the full moon was shining high in the heavens, Lincoln, producing an almanac, proved that, on the night in question, there was in fact no moon at all. Those who were associated with him for years declared that they never knew a lawyer who was so moderate in his charges. Though he attained great reputation in his profession, the highest fee he ever received was $5,000. His strength lay entirely in shrewd common sense, in quickly mastering all the details of a case, and in ready eloquence or debate, for he had very little law learning, and was averse to making researches. But his rare genius for promptly penetrating all the difficulties of a legal or political problem, which aided him so much as president, enabled him to deal with juries in a masterly manner. On one occasion, when 34 witnesses swore to a fact on one side, and exactly as many on the other, Mr. Lincoln proposed a very practical test to the jury. "If you were going to bet on this case," he said, "on which side would you lay a picayune?" Any poor person in distress for want of legal aid could always find a zealous friend in Lincoln. On one occasion, a poor old Negro woman came to him and Mr. Herndon, complaining that her son had been imprisoned at New Orleans for simply going, in his ignorance, ashore, thereby breaking a disgraceful law which then existed, forbidding free men of color from other states to enter Louisiana. Having been condemned to pay a fine, and being without money, the poor man was about to be sold for a slave. Messrs. Lincoln and Herndon, finding no law of avail, ransomed the prisoner out of their own pockets. In those days, a free-born native of a northern state could, if of African descent, be seized and simply sold for setting foot on southern soil. End of Chapter 3.
Chapter 4. The great storm of civil war which now threatened the American ship of state had long been brewing. Year by year the party of slave owners, small in number but strong in union, and unanimously devoted to the acquisition of political power, had progressed, until they saw before them the possibility of ruling the entire continent. To please them, the nation, after purchasing, had admitted as slave territory the immense regions of Louisiana and Florida, and in their interests a war had been waged with Mexico. But, so early as 1820, the North, alarmed at the incredible progress of slave power, and observing that wherever it was established white labor was paralyzed, and that society resolved itself at once into a small aristocracy, with a large number of blacks and poor whites who were systematically degraded, attempted to check its territorial extension. There was a contest, which was finally settled by what was known as the Missouri Compromise, by which it was agreed that Missouri should be admitted as a slave state, but that in future all territory north and west of Missouri, above latitude 36 degrees 30 minutes, should be forever free. While the inhabitants of the eastern and western states applied themselves to every development of industrial pursuits, art, and letters, the Southerners lived by agricultural slave labor, and were entirely devoted to acquiring political power. The contest was unequal, and the result was that, before the rebellion, the slaveholders, who with their slaves only constituted 1/3 of the population of the United States, had secured 2/3 of all the offices, civil, military, or naval, and had elected 2/3 of the presidents. Law after law was passed, giving the slaveholders every advantage, until Governor Henry A. Wise of Virginia declared in Congress that slavery should pour itself abroad, and have no limit but the Southern Ocean. He also asserted that the best way to meet or answer abolition arguments was with death. His house was afterwards, during the war, used for a Negro school, under care of a New England abolitionist. Large pecuniary rewards were offered by governors of slave states for the persons, i.e. the lives, of eminent Northern anti-slavery men. Direct efforts were made to re-establish the slave trade between Africa and the Southern states. In 1839 the Abolition Party was formed, which advocated the total abolition of slavery. This was going too far for the mass of the North, who hoped to live at peace with the South. But still there were many in both the Whig and Democratic parties who wished to see the advance of the slave power checked, and their delegates, meeting at Buffalo in June, 1848, formed the Free Soil Party, opposed to the further extension of slavery, which rapidly grew in power. The struggle became violent. When the territory acquired by war from Mexico was to be admitted to the Union in 1846, David Wilmot of Pennsylvania offered a proviso to the bill accepting the territory, to the effect that slavery should be unknown in it. There was a fierce debate for 2 years over this proviso, which was finally rejected. The most desperate legislation was adopted to make California a slave state, and when she decided by her own will to be free, the slaveholders opposed her admission to the Union. Finally, in 1850, the celebrated compromise measures were adopted. These were to the effect that California should be admitted free, that in New Mexico and Utah the people should decide for themselves as to slavery, and that such of Texas as was above latitude 36 degrees 30 minutes should be free. To this, however, was tacked a new and more cruel fugitive slave law, apparently to humiliate and annoy the free states, and to keep irritation alive. But on the 4th January, 1854, Judge Douglas introduced into the Senate of the United States a bill known as the Kansas-Nebraska Bill, proposing to set aside the Missouri Compromise. This was passed, after a tremendous struggle, on May 22nd, and the slave party triumphed. Yet it proved their ruin, for it was the first decisive step to the strife which ended in civil war. It eventually destroyed Mr. Douglas, its originator. He is said to have reported the deed, and when it became evident that the Union was aroused, and that the Republican would be the winning party, Douglas went over to it. He had long before invoked destruction on the ruthless hand which should disturb the compromise, and now he put forth his own ingenious hand to do the deed and to take the curse, in both of which he was eminently successful. He was defeated by the honester and wiser Lincoln, and died a disappointed man. To suit the slave party, it was originally agreed in 1820 that in future they, though so greatly inferior in number, should have half the territory of the Union. But as they found in time that population increased most rapidly in the free territories, the Compromise of 1850 was arranged, by which the inhabitants of the new states were to decide for themselves in the matter. The result was an immediate and terrible turmoil. The legitimate dwellers in Kansas were almost all steady, law-abiding farmers who hated slavery. But, from Missouri and the neighboring slave states, there was poured in, by means of committees and funds raised in the South, a vast number of border ruffians, or desperadoes, who would remain in Kansas only long enough to vote illegally, or to rob and ravage and then retire. The North, on the other hand, exasperated by these outrages, sent numbers of emigrants to Kansas to support the legitimate settlers, and the result was a virtual civil war, which was the more irritating because President Buchanan did all in his power to aid the border ruffians and crush the legitimate settlers. Day by day it became evident that the Kansas-Nebraska Bill had been passed for the purpose of enabling the South to quit the Union, and ere long this was openly avowed by the slave-holding press and politicians. The entire North was now fiercely irritated. Judge Douglas, returning westwards, tried to speak at Chicago, but was hissed down. At the State Fair in Springfield, Illinois, October 4, 1854, he spoke in defense of the Nebraska Bill, but was replied to by Lincoln with such power as he had never exhibited before. He was no longer the orator he had been, but a newer and greater Lincoln, the like of whom no one in that vast multitude had ever heard. The Nebraska Bill, says W. H. Herndon, was shivered, and, like a tree in the forest, was torn and rent asunder by hot bolts of truth. Douglas was crushed, and his brief reply was a spiritless failure. From this time forth Lincoln's speeches were as unexceptional in form as they were vigorous and logical. Never was there a man of whom it could be said with so much truth that he always rose to the occasion, however great, however unprecedented its demands on his power might be. From Springfield Lincoln followed Douglas to Peoria, where he delivered in debate another great speech. Not liking slavery in itself, Lincoln was willing to let it alone under the old compromise, but he would never suffer its introduction to new territories, and he made it clear as day that Douglas, by opening the floodgate of slavery on free soil, had let loose a torrent which, if unchecked, would sweep everything to destruction. He had previously, at Springfield, disclosed the fallacy of Douglas's great principle by a single sentence: "I admit that the emigrant to Kansas is competent to govern himself, but I deny his right to govern any other person without that person's consent." Such arguments were overwhelming, and Douglas, the giant of the West and the foremost politician in America, felt that he had met his master at his own peculiar weapons, oratory and debate. He sent for Lincoln, and proposed that both should refrain from speaking during the campaign, and Lincoln, conscious of superior strength, agreed. Douglas did speak once more, however, but Lincoln remained silent. At the end of this campaign, Lincoln was elected to the Legislature of Illinois. As the Legislature was about to elect a United States Senator, Lincoln resigned to become a candidate. But at the election, there being 3 candidates, Lincoln, finding that by resigning he could make it sure that an anti-Nebraska man, Judge Trumbull, could be elected, and that there was some uncertainty as to his own success, resigned, in the noblest manner, in favor of his principles and party. It had been the ambition of his life to become a United States Senator. The result of this sacrifice, says Holland, was that, when the Republican party was soon after regularly organized, Lincoln became their foremost man. Meanwhile, the strife in Kansas grew more desperate. One governor after another was appointed to the state, for the express purpose of turning it over to slavery. But the outrageous frauds practiced at the election were too much for Mr. Reeder and his successor, Shannon, and even for his follower, Robert J. Walker, a man not over scrupulous. Walker, like many other Democrats, adroitly turned with the tide, but too late. During 1855, the old parties were breaking up, and the new Republican one was gathering with great rapidity. 2 separate governments or legislatures had formed in Kansas, one manifestly and boldly fraudulent in favor of slavery, and the other settled at Topeka, headed by Governor Reeder, consisting of legitimate settlers. At this time, August 24, 1855, Lincoln wrote to his friend Speed a letter, in which he discussed slavery with great shrewdness. In answer to the standing Southern argument that slavery did not concern Northern people, and that it was none of their business, he replied, "In 1841 you and I had together a tedious low-water trip on a steamboat, from Louisville to St. Louis. You may remember as well as I do that, from Louisville to the mouth of the Ohio, there were on board 10 or a dozen slaves shackled with irons. That sight was a continual torment to me, and I see something like it every time I touch the Ohio, or any other slave border. It is not fair for you to assume that I have no interest in a thing which has, and continually exercises, the power of making me miserable. You ought rather to appreciate how much the great body of the Northern people do crucify their feelings, in order to maintain their loyalty to the Constitution and the Union. I do oppose the extension of slavery, because my judgment and feelings so prompt me, and I am under no obligation to the contrary. If for this you and I must differ, differ we must." On May 29, 1856, Lincoln attended a meeting at Bloomington, Illinois, where, With his powerful assistance, the Republican Party of the state was organized, and delegates were appointed to the National Republican Convention, which was to be held on the 17th of the following month at Philadelphia. The speech which he made on this occasion was of extraordinary power. From this day he was regarded by the Republicans of the West as their leader. Therefore, in the Republican National Convention of 1856, at Philadelphia, the Illinois delegation presented his name for the vice presidency. He received a complimentary vote of 110 votes, the successful candidate, Dayton, having 259. This, however, was his formal introduction to the nation. At this convention, John C. Fremont, a plausible political pretender, was nominated for the presidency. As a candidate for presidential elector, Lincoln again took the field. He made a thorough and energetic canvass, and his greatly improved powers of oratory now manifested themselves. Probably no man in the country, says Layman, discussed the main questions at issue in a manner more original and persuasive. Buchanan, the Democratic candidate, was elected by a small majority. The Republican vote was largely increased by many offensive and inhuman enforcements of the fugitive slave law, for it seemed at this time as if the South had gone mad, and was resolved to do all in its power to irritate the North into war. On March 4, 1857, Buchanan, the last slave president, was inaugurated, and a few days after, Judge Taney of the Supreme Court rendered the famous Dred Scott decision relative to a fugitive Negro slave of that name, to the effect that a man of African slave descent could not be a citizen of the United States, that the prohibition of slavery was unconstitutional, and that it existed by the Constitution in all of the territories. Judge Taney, in fact, declared that the Negro had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. Against the Constitution, against the memory of the nation, against a previous decision, against a series of enactments, he decided that the slave is property, and that the Constitution upholds it against every other property. This decision was regarded as an outrage even by many old Democrats. In the same year, the slavery party in Kansas passed, by fraud and violence, the celebrated Lecompton Constitution, upholding slavery. By this time, Judge Douglas, the author of all this mischief, wishing to be re-elected to the Senate, and finding that there was no chance for him as a pro-slavery candidate, was suddenly seized with indignation at the Lecompton affair, which he pronounced an outrage. The result was the division of the Democratic Party. He then made a powerful speech at Springfield, defending his course with great shrewdness, but it was, as usual, blown to the winds by a reply from Lincoln. Douglas suddenly became a zealous free-soiler, after the manner admirably burlesqued by Petroleum Nasby, when that worthy found it was necessary to become an anti-slavery man to keep his post office. At this time Douglas made his famous assertion that he did not care whether slavery was voted up or down, and in the following year, April 30th, 1858, Congress passed the English Bill, by which the people of Kansas were offered heavy bribes in land if they would accept the Lecompton Constitution, but which the people rejected by an immense majority. On the 16th June, 1858, a Republican state convention at Springfield nominated Lincoln for the Senate, and on the 17th he delivered a bold speech, soon to be known far and wide as the celebrated House Divided Against Itself speech. It began with these words: "If we could first know where we are, and whither we are tending, we could then better judge what to do, and how to do it. We are now far into the 5th year since a policy was initiated with the avowed object and confident promise of putting an end to slavery agitation. Under the operation of that policy, that agitation had not only not ceased, but has constantly augmented. In my opinion, it will not cease until a crisis shall have been reached and passed. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently, half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. Either the opponents of slavery will arrest the further spread of it, and place it where the public mind shall rest in the belief that it is in the course of ultimate extinction, or its advocates will push it forward till it shall become alike lawful in all the states, old as well as new, North as well as South. Have we no tendency to the latter condition? Let anyone who doubts carefully contemplate that now almost complete legal combination, piece of machinery, so to speak, compounded of the Nebraska Doctrine and the Dred Scott decision. Let him consider not only what the work the machinery is adapted to, and how well adapted, but also let him study the history of its construction, and trace, if he can, or rather fail if he can, to trace the evidences of design and concert of action among its chief master workers from the beginning. These were awful words to the world, and with awe were they received. Lincoln was the first man among the moderates who had dared to speak so plainly. His friends were angry, but in due time this tremendous speech had the right effect, for it announced the truth. Meanwhile, Lincoln and Douglas were again paired together as rivals, and at one place the latter put to his adversary a series of questions, which were promptly answered. In return, Lincoln gave Douglas 4 others, by one of which he was asked if the people of a United States territory could in any lawful way, against the wish of any citizen of the United States, exclude slavery from its limits. To which Douglas replied that the people of a territory had the lawful means to exclude slavery by legislative action. This reply brought Douglas into direct antagonism with the pro-slavery men. He hoped, by establishing a platform of his own, to head so many Democrats that the Republicans would welcome his accession and make him president. But Lincoln, by these questions, and by his unyielding attacks, weakened him to his ruin. It is true that Judge Douglas gained his seat in the Senate, but it was by an old and unjust law in the Legislature, as Lincoln really had 4,000 majority. The speeches which Lincoln delivered during this campaign, and which were afterwards published with those of Douglas, were so refined and masterly that many believed they had been revised for him by able friends. But from this time all his oratory indicated an advance in all respects. He was now bent on great things. End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5. It is an almost inevitable law of stern equity in the United States, as it must be in all true republics, that the citizen who has distinguished himself by great services must not expect really great rewards. The celebrity which he has gained seems, in a commonwealth, where all are ambitious of distinction, to be sufficient recompense. It is true that all times some overwhelming favorite, generally a military hero, is made an exception, but there are very few ambitious civilians who do not realize that a prophet is without great honor in his own country. Other instances may occur where aspiring men have carefully concealed their hopes, and of such was Abraham Lincoln. Perhaps his case is best stated by Layman, who declares that he had all the requisites of an available candidate for the presidency, chiefly because he had not been sufficiently prominent in national politics to excite the jealousies of powerful rivals. In order to defeat one another, these rivals will put forward some comparatively unknown man, and thus Lincoln was greatly indebted to the jealousy with which Horace Greeley, a New York politician, regarded his rival, W.H. Seward. Lincoln's abilities were very great, but he knew that becoming modesty in a great man was about as needful as anything else. Therefore, when his friend Pickett suggested that he might aspire to the chief magistracy, he replied, "I do not think I am fit for the presidency." But he had friends who thought differently, and in the winter of 1859, Jackson Grimshaw, Mr. Hatch, the Secretary of State, and Messrs. Bushnell, Judd, and Peck held a meeting, and after a little persuasion induced Lincoln to allow them to put him forward as a candidate for the great office. In October 1859, Lincoln received an invitation from a committee of citizens to give a lecture in New York. He was much pleased with this intimation that he was well known in the East, and wrote out with great care a political address, which, when delivered, was warmly praised by the newspapers, one of which, the Tribune, edited by Horace Greeley, declared that no man ever before made such an impression on his first appeal to a New York audience. The subject of the discourse was most logical, vigorous, and masterly comment upon an assertion which Judge Douglas had made, to the effect that the framers of the Constitution had understood and approved of slavery. No better vindication of the rights of the Republican party to be considered in expressing and carrying out in all respects the opinions of Washington and of the framers of the Constitution was ever set forth. From New York he went to New England, lecturing in many cities, and everywhere verifying what was said of him in the Manchester Mirror, that he spoke with great fairness, candor, and with wonderful interest. He did not abuse the South, the administration, or the Democrats. He is far from prepossessing in personal appearance, and his voice is disagreeable, yet he wins your attention and goodwill from the start. His sense of the ludicrous is very keen, and an exhibition of that is the clincher of all his arguments, not the ludicrous acts of persons, but ludicrous ideas. Hence he is never offensive, and steals away willingly into his train of belief persons who are opposed to him. For the first half hour his opponents would agree with every word he uttered, and from that point he began to lead them off, little by little, until it seemed as if he had got them all into his fold. Lincoln was now approaching with great rapidity the summit of his wishes. On May 9th and 10th, the Republican State Convention met at Springfield for the purpose of nominating a candidate for the presidency, and it is said that Lincoln did not appear to have had any idea that any business relative to himself was to be transacted. For it is unquestionable that, while very ambitious, he was at the same time remarkably modest. When he went to lecture in New York, and the press reporters asked him for slips or copies of his speech, he was astonished, not feeling sure whether the newspapers would care to publish it. At this convention he was sitting on his heels in a back part of the room, and the governor of Illinois, as soon as the meeting was organized, rose and said, "I am informed that a distinguished citizen of Illinois, and one whom Illinois will ever delight to honor, is present, and I wish to move that this body invite him to a seat on the stand." And pausing, he exclaimed, "Abraham Lincoln." There was tremendous applause, and the mob, seizing Lincoln, raised him in their arms, and bore him, sturdily resisting, to the platform. A gentleman who was present said, "I then thought him one of the most diffident and worst plagued men I ever saw." The next proceeding was most amusing and characteristic, it being the entrance of old John Hanks, with 2 fence rails bearing the inscription, "2 rails from a lot made by Abraham Lincoln and John Hanks in the Sangamon Bottom in the year 1830. The end was that Lincoln was the declared candidate of his state for the presidency. But there were other candidates from other states, and at the great convention in Chicago on May 16th there was as fierce intriguing and as much shrewdness shown as ever attended the election of a pope. After publishing the platform, or declaration of the principles of the Republican party, which was in the main a stern denunciation of all further extension of slavery, with a declaration in favor of protection, the rights of foreign citizens, and a Pacific railroad, the convention proceeding to the main business. It was soon apparent that the real strife lay between W.H. Seward, of New York, and Abraham Lincoln. It would avail little to expose all the influences of trickery and enmity resorted to by the friends of either candidate on this occasion. Suffice it to say, eventually, Lincoln received the nomination, which was the prelude to the most eventful election ever witnessed in America. What followed has been well described by laymen. All that day and all the day previous, Mr. Lincoln was at Springfield, trying to behave as usual, but watching, with nervous anxiety, the proceedings of the convention as they were reported by telegraph. On both days he played a great deal at fives in a ball alley. It is probable that he took this physical mode of working off or keeping down the excitement that threatened to possess him. About 9 o'clock in the morning, Mr. Lincoln came to the office of Lincoln and Herndon. Mr. Baker entered, with a telegram which said the names of the candidates had been announced, and that Mr. Lincoln had been received with more applause than any other. When the news of the first ballot came over the wire, it was apparent to all present that Mr. Lincoln thought it very favorable. He believed if Mr. Seward failed to get the nomination, or to come very near it, on the first ballot, he would fail altogether. Presently news of the second ballot arrived, and then Mr. Lincoln showed by his manner that he considered the contest no longer doubtful. "I've got him," said he. When the decisive dispatch at length arrived, there was great commotion. Mr. Lincoln seemed to be calm, but a close observer could detect in his countenance the indications of deep emotion. In the meantime, cheers for Lincoln swelled up from the streets, and began to be heard through the town. Someone remarked, "Mr. Lincoln, I suppose now we will soon have a book containing your life." "There is not much," he replied, "in my past life about which to write a book, as it seems to me." Having received the hearty congratulations of the company in the office, he descended to the street, where he was immediately surrounded by Irish and American citizens, and, so long as he was willing to receive it, There was great handshaking and felicitating. "Gentlemen," said the great man, with a happy twinkle in his eye, "you had better come up and shake my hand while you can. Honours elevate some men, you know." But he soon bethought him of a person who was of more importance to him than all this crowd. Looking towards his house, he said, "Well, gentlemen, there is a little short woman at our house who is probably more interested in this dispatch than I am, and, if you will excuse me, I will take it up and let her see it." The division caused by Douglas in the Democratic party to further his own personal ambition utterly destroyed its power for a long time. The result was a division, one convention nominating Judge Douglas for the presidency, with Mr. Johnson of Georgia as vice president, and the other, John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky, with Joseph Lane of Oregon, for the second office. Still another party, the Constitutional Union Party, nominated John Bell of Tennessee and Edward Everett of Massachusetts for president and vice president. Thus there were four rival armies in the political field, soon to be merged into two in real strife. On November 6, 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected President of the United States, receiving 1,857,610 votes. Douglas had 1,291,574, Breckinridge 850,082, Bell 646,124. Of all the votes really cast, there was a majority of 930,170 against Lincoln, a fact which was afterwards continually urged by the Southern party, which called him the minority president. But when the electors who are chosen to elect the president met, they gave Lincoln 180 votes, Breckinridge 72, Bell 30, while Douglas, who might beyond question have been the successful candidate had he been less crafty, received only 12. The strife between him and Lincoln had been like that between the giant and the hero in the Norse mythology, wherein the two gave to each other riddles, on the successful answers to which their lives depended. Judge Douglas strove to entrap Lincoln with a long series of questions which were easily eluded, but one was demanded of the questioner himself, and the answer he gave to it proved his destruction. The immediate result of Lincoln's election was such a rush of hungry politicians seeking office as had never before been witnessed. As every appointment in the United States, from the smallest post office to a secretaryship, is in the direct gift of the President, the newly elected found himself attacked by thousands of place hunters, ready to prove that they were the most deserving men in the world for reward. And if they did not, as Artemus Ward declares, come down the chimneys of the White House to interview him, they at least besieged him with such pertinacity, and made him so thoroughly wretched, that he is said to have at last replied to one man who insisted that it was really to his exertions that the President owed his election, "If that be so, I wonder you are not ashamed to look me in the face, for getting me into such an abominable situation." From his own good nature, and from a sincere desire to really deserve his popular name of Honest Old Abe, Lincoln determined to appoint the best men to office, irrespective of party. Hoping against hope to preserve the Union, he would have given place in his cabinet to Southern Democrats as well as to Northern Republicans. But as soon as it was understood that he was elected, and that the country would have a president opposed to the extension of slavery, the South began to prepare to leave the Union, and for war. It was in vain that Lincoln and the great majority of his party made it clear as possible that, rather than see the country destroyed by war and by disunion, they would leave slavery as it was. This did not suit the views of the rule or ruin party of the South, and as secession from the Federal Union became a fixed fact, their entire press and all their politicians declared that their object was not merely to build up a Southern Confederacy, but to legislate so as to destroy the industry of the North, and break the old Union into 1,000 conflicting independent governments. Therefore, Lincoln, in intending to offer seats in the cabinet to Alexander H. Stephens, James Guthrie of Kentucky, and John A. Gilmer of North Carolina, made, if sincere, a great mistake, though one in every way creditable to his heart and his courtesy. The truth was, that the South had for 4 years unanimously determined to secede, and was actually seceding, while the North, which had gone beyond the extreme limits of endurance and of justice itself to conciliate the South, could not believe that fellow countrymen and brothers seriously intended war, for it was predetermined and announced by the Southern press that, unless the federal government would make concessions beyond all reason, and put itself in the position of a disgraced and conquered state, there must be war. As the terrible darkness began to gather, and the storm signals to appear, Lincoln sought for temporary relief in visiting his stepmother and other old friends and relatives in Coles County. The meeting with her, whom he had always regarded as his mother, was very touching. It was the more affecting because she, to whom he was the dearest on earth, was under an impression, which time rendered prophetic, that he would, as president, be assassinated. This anticipation spread among his friends, who vied with one another in gloomy suggestions of many forms of murder, while one very zealous prophet, who had fixed on poison as the means by which Lincoln would die, urged him to take as a cook from home one among his own female friends. End of chapter 5.